He couldn't read a word on a blackboard. His teachers called him stupid and lazy. He was regularly beaten at boarding school, bottom of every class, and dropped out at 15 years old without a single qualification to his name. You would think someone who could not process written language could never build a business empire, right? Well, Richard Branson managed to build a company with over 400 businesses spanning 35 countries. He created Virgin Atlantic, one of the most celebrated airlines in the world, taking on British Airways, Pan Am, and TWA with a single second-hand plane and a chalkboard. He became a billionaire, and he did it all as a man who, for most of his life, did not even know he was dyslexic. So how did the boy who sat at the back of every classroom, staring at what he described as jumbo jumbo on the blackboard, become one of the most recognizable entrepreneurs on the planet? To find out, we have to go back to 1950, to the quiet suburbs of Surrey, England, where a boy was born who would one day shake the entire aviation industry to its core. Richard Charles Nicholas Branson arrived on July 18, 1950, in Shamley Green, Surrey, to parents who could not have been more different from each other and yet could not have been more perfectly matched to produce the man their son would become. His father, Ted, was a barrister. He was steady, professional, measured. His mother, Eve, was a former ballet dancer, a glider pilot, and a flight attendant who believed, fiercely and unapologetically, that children needed to be tested. She would drop young Richard off miles from home and tell him to find his way back. She believed that if you wanted something in life, you figured it out. I want you to remember that, because it matters enormously later. The problem was, school wasn't the kind of test Eve Branson had in mind. From the moment young Richard stepped into a classroom, it became painfully clear that the traditional educational system had no idea what to do with him. Words on the blackboard looked like scrambled noise. Letters refused to stay in their correct order. He would stare at a sentence and feel nothing connect, no meaning, no clarity. Just the gnawing anxiety of a child who desperately wanted to understand why everyone else seemed to find it so easy. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, dyslexia wasn't widely understood. It had not even been formally named in the way we recognize it today. So teachers looked at little Richard Branson, and they did not see a child processing the world differently. They saw a child who was not trying. Branson would later write on his blog that his teachers thought he was stupid, lazy, or both. Words just looked like jumbles of letters on the blackboard to him. At 7 years old, he was sent to boarding school. He would remember the experience as miserable. He was regularly beaten. His grades were at the absolute bottom. And yet, even then, buried beneath all the academic failure, something was stirring. Richard Branson had an extraordinary ability to connect with people. He could read a room faster than he could ever read a page. He could sense what made people excited, what made them feel valued, what they were hungry for. He just could not demonstrate it on a test. The head teacher at his school delivered what he intended as a damning farewell when young Richard finally left. He looked at this failing, below-average student and told him he predicted that Richard would either end up in prison or become a millionaire. He meant it as a warning, and he would not have guessed, not for a single moment, that he was actually giving a prophecy. And here is the cruel irony that Branson has carried with him for his entire adult life. He was not diagnosed with dyslexia until his 20s. By the time he finally understood why the classroom had been such torture, he had already dropped out, already launched a business, already started building. For years, he had simply assumed he was the problem, that the teacher calling him lazy was right, that being called stupid was a fair description. He had internalized the judgment of a system that did not have the tools to understand him. and he had carried that weight with him into everything he did, using it sometimes as fuel, sometimes as a wound, but never letting it stop. He said he quit school at 15 because he was dyslexic. In an interview with NBC News about his educational charity, he said he did not know he was dyslexic and that it had not really been invented when he was at school. It had not been invented. That sentence deserves a moment. The thing that explained everything, the thing that would have changed the entire trajectory of his childhood, simply did not exist yet in the popular understanding of how human minds work. Branson was failed not because anyone was malicious, but because the world genuinely did not know what to do with someone like him. And what that experience gave him, oddly, was a profound and lifelong skepticism of the conventional, of experts, of people who told you the only way to do something was the way it had always been done. Richard Branson had achieved nothing on paper, but the limitation he could not read was not going away. He was about to discover that the world beyond the classroom might have entirely different rules. 16 years old and free from the institution that had spent a decade telling him he wasn't good enough, Branson wasted absolutely no time. His mother's belief in testing himself, in diving in and figuring it out, had sunk deep. And in 1966, he launched his very first business, a magazine called Student, aimed at giving young people a genuine voice on the issues of the day. Vietnam, music, youth culture, the things that mattered to his generation. Now, I want you to picture this for a moment. A 16-year-old boy who struggles to read, sitting down to launch a publication, a magazine made of words. It would be almost funny if it weren't so perfectly, stubbornly Branson. But here's what you have to understand about how his mind worked. Richard Branson didn't need to be the best writer in the room. He needed to find the best writers in the room and convince them to work for him. He would call journalists, celebrities, musicians, people who had no reason to give a teenager the time of day, and somehow, through sheer charm and infectious enthusiasm, persuade them to contribute. He managed to interview Mick Jagger. He convinced Vanessa Redgrave to give him time. He sold almost $8,000 worth of advertising for the very first issue, not because he had a business degree, because he knew how to make people feel like they were part of something real. Student performed reasonably well, but Branson's restless mind was already looking at the next opportunity. In 1970, he set up a mail-order record business to sell the latest albums at lower prices than the high street shops. He called it Virgin Records because we are all virgins at business. That self-deprecating honesty, that willingness to admit he was figuring it out as he went, would become a hallmark of everything he built. The mail-order business was immediately successful. In 1972, Branson opened Virgin Records' first physical store on Oxford Street in London, followed quickly by a recording studio in a run-down country house in Oxfordshire. That studio would record something that changed everything. A musician named Mike Oldfield brought in an experimental album called Tubular Bells, and Branson, who had never run a record label in his life, decided to release it. The album would stay on the United Kingdom charts for 247 weeks. It launched one of the most successful independent record labels in history. By the end of the 1970s, Virgin Records had signed the Sex Pistols, Culture Club, Genesis, and Phil Collins. Branson's empire was growing, and his dyslexic mind, the one that could not track letters on a page, but could instantly identify patterns, opportunities, and the human needs behind every transaction, was firing on all cylinders. But let me give you a sense of how close to the edge it all was, because this matters for understanding everything that comes after. In 1971, Branson and his team had a crisis that should have ended everything before it ever really started. To get around purchase taxes on imported records, Virgin had been selling records in the shop that had been declared for export but never actually left the country. The scheme worked until it did not. Customs officers arrived, the full extent of the operation was uncovered, and Richard Branson was arrested. He spent a night in a police cell. He was 20 years old. He had no degree, no formal business training, no legal expertise. His mother, Eve, the same mother who had dropped him miles from home and told him to find his way back, put up the family home as collateral to pay a settlement with the customs authorities. The charges were eventually resolved without a criminal conviction, but the experience shook Branson deeply. He has said, it changed him permanently. He later wrote that he vowed never again to do anything that would embarrass his family. From that moment forward, the recklessness had an edge to it. The willingness to take risks, yes, but calculated ones. Risks where he understood and had protected the downside. It was, in its own way, another lesson that no classroom had been able to teach him. However, success in music did not mean success was guaranteed everywhere. In the early 1980s, Branson made his first attempt to take Virgin public, listing the company on the stock market. He wanted to expand rapidly into the United States. He believed the Virgin brand could be global. For a brief, exciting moment, it looked like it might work. But in October 1987, the stock market crashed. The value of the company plummeted almost overnight. Branson made a gut-wrenching decision and took Virgin private again, pulling back from the public markets to protect what he had built. It cost him enormously, but it was, he would later say, the right call. Yet something much bigger was already on his mind. It had started with a cancelled flight. The story of how Virgin Atlantic was born is, in a way, the most perfectly Branson story ever told. In the early 1980s, a younger Richard Branson was waiting at an airport in Puerto Rico for a connecting flight to the British Virgin Islands. He had just bought an island called Necker and was very keen to get back to it. His American Airlines flight was suddenly cancelled due to lack of passengers. Most people would have sighed, found a seat, and waited for the next available flight. Not Branson. He walked to the back of the airport, chartered a small plane, borrowed a chalkboard, and wrote Virgin Airways, $39 for a single flight to the British Virgin Islands. He went around to every stranded passenger and filled the plane himself. As they landed, a passenger told him that Virgin Airways was not too bad, and that if he smartened up the service, he could be in business. He did not sleep much that night. He later wrote that this led to a big what-if moment. He wrote that he traveled a lot, watching and signing bands and doing deals, and that traveling by plane was not fun. It was awful. Tickets were expensive, service was terrible, the food was worse, and there was no competition to push the airlines to do anything about it. He realized there was a gap in the market. What if we did something different and gave passengers a great experience? The next morning, Branson got on the phone to Boeing. He recalled that they were amused to hear an Englishman from the music business asking what kinds of deals were available on a jumbo jet. He spent all afternoon on the phone, then all evening. By the time the call was over, Boeing had agreed to lease him a second-hand Boeing 747-200, registration GVRG, for a year, with an option to return it if things did not work out. It was the perfect arrangement for a man who believed passionately in protecting the downside before betting on the upside. If this did not work in a year, he could walk away. He would never have started if the downside was not manageable. That right there is the Branson principle that runs through everything he ever built. But before he could launch, Branson made one of the shrewdest moves of his life. He sought out Sir Freddie Laker, the man who had pioneered low-cost transatlantic flights before British Airways helped crush his airline out of existence. Laker looked Branson dead in the eye and gave him 2 pieces of advice. The first piece of advice was about structure. Don't go all economy, the margins are too thin. Build a premium offering. Branson listened carefully and would go on to pioneer a genuine 3-class model on transatlantic routes. The second piece of advice was more ominous. British Airways will try to wipe you off the map like they did to me, Laker told him. 3 words of wisdom: sue the bastards. Branson would hear those words again years later, in a moment he could never have imagined. In February 1984, Branson called a press conference and announced Virgin Atlantic to the world. The aviation establishment was baffled. Here was a music man, a dyslexic school dropout who could not read a spreadsheet without help, announcing he was going to take on British Airways, Pan Am, and TWA with 1 second-hand airplane. The financial press was skeptical, to put it politely. Industry insiders openly dismissed the idea. The conventional wisdom was unanimous. You cannot launch a transatlantic airline from scratch with no aviation experience and expect to survive. The capital requirements alone were staggering. The regulatory barriers were immense, and the competitors he was taking on had been doing this for decades, with fleets of hundreds of aircraft. Branson had 1 plane, 1 route, 1 year to prove it worked. However, on June 22, 1984, Virgin Atlantic Flight 5S1 departed from London Gatwick for Newark, New Jersey. The plane was christened Maiden Voyager. It carried journalists, celebrities, Virgin employees, and 70 cases of champagne. The flight was, by all accounts, an 8-hour party in the sky. The airline was profitable in its very first year. Branson understood something the established airlines had completely forgotten. Flying was supposed to feel like an adventure. He hired cabin crew who actually smiled. He introduced seatback video screens, the first airline in the world to do so. He put live entertainment on board. He opened stylish airport lounges. He treated passengers like guests rather than cargo. And because he had spent a decade promoting musicians like Culture Club and Simple Minds, he used every tool of marketing and public relations he had ever learned to make Virgin Atlantic the airline you flew if you wanted to feel like you were part of something exciting. By the late 1980s, Virgin Atlantic was growing. New routes were being added. The brand was gaining genuine momentum. And Branson's impossible gamble was beginning to look like something far more permanent. The airline was doing something that nobody had expected. It was not just surviving, it was changing the rules. In an era when air travel was dominated by stuffy legacy carriers that treated economy passengers like an inconvenience, Virgin Atlantic asked a radical question. What if we actually tried to make this enjoyable? What if the flight itself was part of the experience rather than just the exhausting prelude to it? The answer reshaped the industry. Virgin Atlantic was the first airline to introduce individual seatback television screens, giving every passenger their own entertainment system, a concept so obvious in retrospect that it is almost hard to believe nobody had done it before. They created genuinely designed airport lounges with shower facilities, cocktail bars, and spaces that felt like places you actually wanted to be. They introduced Upper Class, a business-class product so distinctive and comfortable, it would become the benchmark against which every competitor measured their own premium offering for the next 2 decades. But it was not just the product, it was the people. Branson had always believed, with almost evangelical intensity, that the most important thing in any business was the people who worked in it. At Virgin Atlantic, the cabin crew were not just service staff, they were the brand. They were hired for personality, trained for excellence, and genuinely empowered to create moments that passengers would remember. This philosophy, so natural to Branson, was almost incomprehensible to the traditional airline establishment, which ran its crew like an operational efficiency calculation. Virgin's crew loved working there. Passengers could feel it at 30,000 feet. This is where things would take a very dark turn. British Airways had been watching Virgin Atlantic's rise with increasing concern. BA was the state-born giant of British aviation. 300 aircraft, decades of institutional power, politicians in its orbit, and a deep-seated belief that no upstart with one second-hand 747 had any right to exist in its market. When Virgin Atlantic moved operations to London Heathrow in 1991, gaining slots at Britain's primary hub airport and putting itself in direct head-to-head competition with BA on its home turf, something shifted inside the corridors of BA's power. BA's chairman, Lord King, reportedly made his frustration clear to his leadership team. Do something about Branson. What followed was one of the most extraordinary corporate scandals in British business history. It became known as the Dirty Tricks campaign, and when Branson eventually discovered the full extent of it, it would nearly break him. BA hackers were accessing Virgin Atlantic's computer systems on a daily basis, stealing confidential passenger data. BA staff were calling Virgin customers, impersonating Virgin employees, and attempting to poach them onto BA flights. BA representatives were approaching stranded Virgin passengers at airports and in their homes. False stories were being planted in newspapers, designed to damage Virgin's reputation. Documents related to the campaign were being systematically shredded. It was systematic, calculated sabotage, designed not to outcompete Virgin, but to eliminate it entirely. Branson later recalled on NPR's How I Built This that they had about 4 planes flying and that BA went to extraordinary lengths to put them out of business. He called the tactics extraordinary. In December 1991, tipped off by a BA insider, Branson went public. He wrote an open letter to BA's non-executive directors detailing the allegations. The response from BA was to deny everything, and then, fatally, to sue Branson for making the allegations in the first place. That was a mistake, because when BA's lawyers went looking for evidence to defend the libel case, they found something else entirely. They found the evidence of everything Virgin had alleged, and more. The lawyers quietly told BA's management what they had discovered. And on January 11, 1993, British Airways settled out of court. The settlement was, at the time, the largest libel settlement in British legal history, $945,000, plus legal fees that ran to nearly £3 million. Lord King, BA's chairman, issued a public apology so humiliating that the press could not quite believe what they were reading. In the statement, British Airways acknowledged that their staff had accessed Virgin's computers without permission, had approached Virgin passengers in ways that were inappropriate, and had been involved in a campaign that was, by any measure, an attempt to destroy a competitor through illegal means. The Sun newspaper ran the headline, "Virgin Screws BA." BA paid Richard Branson £500,000 in damages. They paid Virgin Atlantic a further £110,000. They covered legal fees that ran to nearly £3 million. They issued a public apology. Lord King resigned ahead of schedule. Multiple senior BA staff departed. And Branson, in one of the most celebrated acts of corporate generosity in British business history, took every penny of his personal settlement and distributed it equally to every single Virgin Atlantic employee. He called it the BA bonus. Branson later said they tried to kill us and that they were still here. Bookings surged 30% overnight. The British public loved the story. A small, scrappy, unassuming airline founded by a man who couldn't read, taking on the establishment and winning. The brand value that campaign created for Virgin Atlantic has been estimated by analysts at over £100 million. BA had tried to destroy them. Instead, they had made them legendary. However, winning the legal battle did not mean the financial battle was over. You see, through all of this, the dirty tricks campaign, the legal fight, the public war, Branson had been running out of money. Virgin Atlantic was locked in an expensive war of attrition, and the resources needed to fight and win were straining the entire Virgin Group to its breaking point. By 1992, the situation was critical. Branson faced a decision that he has described as the hardest of his professional life. He could try to save both Virgin Records and Virgin Atlantic simultaneously and risk losing them both. Or he could sacrifice the thing he loved most to save the thing he believed in. Years later, he said that Virgin Atlantic was a child at school who was being bullied. I had to really turn my attention to the child that was being bullied. What I decided was, if I sold Virgin Records, all the people's jobs would be secure. I could then use that money to build and protect Virgin Atlantic. In June 1992, Richard Branson sold Virgin Records to Thorn EMI for nearly $1 billion. The label had just signed Janet Jackson and the Rolling Stones. It was at the peak of its cultural power, and he wept. He has never made a secret of that. He wept because that record company, born from a mail-order operation run by a school dropout who couldn't read properly, had been the beginning of everything. It had been his proof to himself and to the world that the boy at the back of the classroom had something to offer. But by this point, I think you know what happens next. The money went into Virgin Atlantic, the airline survived, and what Branson built with the resources from that sale would dwarf everything that came before it. Virgin Trains, Virgin Mobile, Virgin Hotels, Virgin Galactic, tens of thousands of jobs, tens of billions in combined enterprise value. He said he did not think he would have gone to space on his own spaceship if he had not made that decision, with characteristic understatement. The Virgin Atlantic that emerged from the dirty tricks war and the sale of the record company was a fundamentally stronger institution. It had been tested in ways most businesses never are. It had survived corporate espionage, a billion-dollar sacrifice, and a legal war against one of the most powerful companies in British history, and it had won every single time. By the mid-1990s, Virgin Atlantic held roughly 30% of London's premium transatlantic market. The airline that aviation insiders had dismissed as a joke in 1984 was now a genuine force, not just in market share, but in the very idea of what an airline could be. Virgin had pioneered the seatback entertainment system that every airline in the world now uses. It had reimagined the airport lounge as a destination rather than a waiting room. It had proven that customer experience, not just price, could be a durable competitive advantage. And the man who had built it still couldn't read a balance sheet without help. There is a famous story, widely reported and confirmed by multiple sources, about a board meeting at Virgin early in the airline's history, when a senior director pulled Branson aside after the meeting to explain the difference between net profit and gross profit. Basic concepts, foundational business vocabulary. Branson did not know the distinction. He had been running a growing airline without knowing it. He was not embarrassed by this. He simply delegated it to someone who did know. That was the genius, you see, not the knowledge he lacked, but the judgment to find people who had what he did not, and then trust them completely. Branson has said he used his dyslexia to his advantage and learned to delegate those tasks he was not so good at. He said that, by and large, dyslexics are more creative and good at seeing the bigger picture, and that they do think slightly differently to other people. Differently, that word matters. Because everything Branson built, every time he looked at an existing industry and saw not the rules but the gap, not the barrier but the opportunity, that was his mind working in the precise way that the British school system of the 1950s and 1960s had punished and dismissed and beaten him for. The restlessness that looked like failure in a classroom was the engine of every venture he ever launched. The inability to process text the way others did forced him to process people instead, to read rooms and emotions and desires with a precision that no textbook had ever captured. He didn't succeed despite his dyslexia. He succeeded in a very real sense because of who his dyslexia made him. When he launched Virgin Atlantic with one plane, he didn't do a detailed financial analysis. He called Boeing from his gut and figured it out as he went. When he was told British Airways would come for him, he didn't hire defensive lawyers and go quiet. He sued the bastards. When he had to choose between his first love and his future, he wept, then he sold, and then he built something bigger than either. Branson has said, "Out in the real world, my dyslexia became my massive advantage. It helped me to think creatively and laterally and see solutions where others saw problems." Today, Virgin Atlantic serves destinations across North America, the Caribbean, Africa, South Asia, and beyond. It pioneered the transatlantic routes that every major carrier now competes on. And it did so with a philosophy so simple, it almost sounds naive: to make flying feel like something worth doing. The airline that launched with a single second-hand 747 and a party in the sky has carried tens of millions of passengers, employed tens of thousands of people, and fundamentally changed the way the aviation industry thinks about the passenger experience. Richard Branson himself went on to build or launch over 400 companies under the Virgin brand. He crossed the Atlantic by powerboat, setting a world record in 1986. He crossed it by hot air balloon, nearly dying in the attempt. He launched Virgin Mobile, Virgin Trains, Virgin Hotels, Virgin Active, and Virgin Galactic, the space company he flew on himself in July 2021, becoming one of the first entrepreneurs to travel to space on a vehicle he had funded and championed. He was knighted by Queen Elizabeth II in the year 2000 for his services to entrepreneurship. Sir Richard Branson, the boy who sat at the back of every classroom staring at jumbled letters, who was beaten at boarding school and told he would end up in prison, who dropped out at 15 without a single qualification. And yet, the number that perhaps says the most about everything Branson built comes not from his personal net worth, now estimated at around $3 billion, nor from the combined revenue of the Virgin Group. It comes from a much simpler place. When Virgin Atlantic launched in 1984, the average transatlantic flight experience was described by the people who used it as expensive, joyless, and hostile. By the time Virgin had been in the air for a decade, every major carrier on the route, British Airways, American Airlines, and United, had fundamentally restructured their passenger experience programs. Seatback screens, improved food, genuine service standards. Not because they wanted to, but because Branson had shown their customers what flying could feel like, and those customers would never unsee it. One airline, started by a dyslexic school dropout with a second-hand plane and a borrowed chalkboard, changed the expectations of an entire industry. The legacy of Virgin Atlantic, though, isn't simply about what Branson accomplished. It's about what he represents for everyone who was ever told by a teacher or a test result, or by a system that wasn't built for them, that they were not enough. Branson has spent decades advocating for dyslexic thinkers, most recently founding Dyslexic U, the first free online university specifically designed to support and empower people with dyslexia. He has made it his mission not just to succeed, but to go back and pull the door open for everyone who is sitting where he once sat, at the back of the classroom, waiting for the bell to ring so they can go and figure out what they're actually for. He has said, if you're a dyslexic person, you can go on and learn more about how incredibly successful dyslexic people have used their dyslexic thinking to turbocharge their careers. A boy who couldn't read his own name on a school register became one of the most powerful creators in modern business history. He built an airline with a chalkboard and a cancelled flight, and with an unshakable belief that people deserved better than what they were being given. He survived British Airways' best attempt to destroy him. He sold the thing he loved most to save the thing he believed in, and he emerged on the other side with a brand that stands for something most companies can only hope to approximate: the genuine, stubborn, infectious idea that business should be an adventure. Richard Branson proved that the limitation was never the letters on the page. It was always the assumption that reading them was the only way to learn what matters.